The wagon slowed on the ridge road, and the driver did not need a reason to stop. Everyone stopped there that autumn. Below the road, on a slope too steep for a plow and too rocky for a pasture, a man was stacking stones the size of washtubs, one on top of another, with no house around them, no roof, no walls, just a wall of boulders rising along the hillside, like the spine of something buried and only half dug out. He did not look up when the wagon stopped. He had stopped looking up weeks ago. The driver counted the stones out of habit, the way a man counts fence posts on a road he has traveled 100 times. 13 feet, near enough, from the base to where the stacking ended for the day. Long enough to run the length of a small barn, and not one beam of a house standing anywhere near it. Somebody would say later that he had lost the last of his money on the stone instead of the lumber. Somebody else would say the cold had gotten to him before the winter even had the chance. Neither of them asked why a man with no house left would spend his last good weeks of daylight building a wall for a house that did not exist yet. Neither of them had stood where he was standing, at the exact hour he had stood there, watching something the rest of the valley had walked past for years, without ever once looking down. By the time the first hard frost came, the wall would still be unfinished, and half the valley would still think he had wasted the only chance he had left. They would be wrong, but not for the reason anyone expected, and not without the wall nearly finishing him first. 2 years before the wagon stopped on the ridge road, Ezra Holt had a farm with level ground, a good well, and a wife who sang while she worked the churn. None of that survived the spring. The river changed its mind. The water came up slow at first, the way trouble often does, giving him 3 days to move what mattered and pretend the rest could wait. It could not wait. By the 4th morning, the lower field was gone. The barn was leaning at an angle no barn should lean, and the topsoil his father had worked for 20 years was somewhere downstream, feeding somebody else's land. He rebuilt what he could. He always rebuilt what he could. That had never been the part that broke him. The fever came the following winter, and it did not ask permission the way the flood had. It took his wife in 11 days, quietly, in the same bed where his daughter had been born 4 years earlier. Ezra buried her on a hillside that wasn't even his own, because the flood had already taken the ground where he would have chosen to lay her. After that, the farm stopped feeling like a reason to stay. He sold what remained of it, quilt and all except one, and used the money to buy the only land left in the county that nobody else wanted. 30 acres of steep hillside, half of it rock, all of it facing the wrong direction for easy farming. The previous owner had walked away from it without finishing a single wall. Neighbors said the wind came off that ridge like it had a grudge against the place. Ezra did not buy it because he believed the stories were wrong. He bought it because it was the only ground his money could still afford, and because his daughter, Hannah, 6 years old, and still asking when her mother was coming back, needed somewhere to sleep that was not a rented room above a feed store. He told himself the land would teach him what it needed. He did not yet know how literally that would turn out to be true. What he knew, standing on that hillside for the first time with Hannah's small hand in his, was simpler and harder than any lesson the ground would later offer. Winter was coming. He had no house, and he had already run out of easy choices months before he ever picked up the first stone. The first structure Ezra built was the one any reasonable man would have built. 4 log walls, notched and stacked the way his father had taught him, chinked with mud and moss the way half the cabins in the county were chinked. It went up in 11 days, and for 11 days he believed the worst of his troubles were behind him. The wind proved him wrong on the 12th night. It did not arrive as a storm. It arrived as a draft that found the north wall first, slipping through a chink no wider than a knife blade. And by midnight, it had found 3 more. Ezra lay awake, listening to the fire struggle in the hearth, watching the flame lean sideways as though something inside the room itself were breathing against it. Hannah woke coughing near 2 in the morning. Not sick. Not yet, but cold enough that her small chest was fighting the air instead of resting in it. Ezra pulled his late wife's wedding quilt from the trunk and wrapped it around her twice, and still her hands stayed cold enough to worry him. He spent that night feeding the fire every 20 minutes, watching frost creep along the inside of the north wall despite the flames 3 feet away. By morning, the water bucket by the door had a skin of ice on it, indoors, in a cabin with a fire that had never gone out. The gaps were the obvious answer, and he spent the following week packing them tighter with clay and dry grass, the way any neighbor would have advised him. It helped. It did not solve the problem. The wind off that ridge did not need many openings. It only needed one, and the hillside seemed determined to keep finding it for him. Ezra began to understand something he could not yet explain. The cabin was not simply losing heat through poor construction. The hillside itself was funneling cold air down through the rocks above the cabin site, the way water finds a channel, whether or not anyone dug one. He did not have the words for it that week. He only had a 6-year-old daughter whose hands would not stay warm, and a growing suspicion that fixing the cracks in his walls was not going to be enough to fix whatever was wrong with where he had chosen to put them. Nathaniel Price had ranched the valley floor below that ridge for 19 years, and in that time he had watched 3 different men try to make a living on the slope where Ezra now stood. None of them had lasted a full winter. He rode up not to mock, but because it was the kind of thing a decent neighbor did before the snow made the road impassable. He found Ezra repacking clay into the same wall for the 2nd time that week, and he did not waste time on pleasantries the cold did not allow for. "You know what's up there," Nathaniel said, nodding toward the rock face above the cabin. "Same wind that took Halloran's roof off in about 58. Same wind that put Deacon Weiss back in town before Christmas, and he'd built stronger than you're building now." Ezra kept working the clay with his thumb. "I've heard the stories." "Then you know staying up here isn't stubbornness, it's arithmetic. You've got a girl in there with a cough she didn't have a month ago. You've got maybe 6 weeks before the real cold sets in, and you've already lost 1 fight to a wind you can't even see coming." It was not an unreasonable argument, and Ezra did not treat it as one. Nathaniel had buried a brother on that same ridge, years before Ezra had ever arrived, in a winter that county records would later describe only in passing. He had every right to distrust the ground. "There's cheaper land 2 miles south," Nathaniel offered. "Flatter, kinder. I could help you move what you've built before the frost sets the logs too hard to shift." Ezra looked past him, toward the rock outcropping above the cabin, the same stone that had been funneling cold air down onto his family for 2 weeks running. He had spent enough nights now studying that wind to notice something Nathaniel's warning had not accounted for. The cold did not come from everywhere on that hillside. It came from one direction, consistently, as though the rock itself were choosing a path. "I appreciate it," Ezra said. "I need a few more days before I decide anything." Nathaniel did not argue further. He simply nodded the way a man nods when he has said his piece and knows the rest is not his to control, and he rode back down toward the valley floor, leaving Ezra alone with a cough in the cabin behind him, and a question he had not yet learned how to answer. The answer came from a place Ezra had walked past a dozen times without truly seeing it. 3 days after Nathaniel's visit, he climbed the slope above the cabin before dawn, checking a fence line that had come loose in the wind, and he found deer tracks pressed into the frost along the base of the largest boulder outcrop. Not scattered tracks, a worn patch, packed down, and returned to often enough that the ground beneath it had stayed bare of snow entirely, while frost lay thick everywhere around it. He crouched beside the patch and put his bare hand flat against the stone. It was not warm. He would tell people later when they asked that it was never warm to the touch, not in any way a man could feel proud of. But it was different from the air around it, and different from every other rock on that hillside he tested that same morning, moving from outcrop to outcrop with the patience of a man who had run out of other plans. The deer had not chosen that spot by accident. Animals rarely bed down anywhere without a reason, and this one had chosen the one place on the entire slope where the wind seemed to lose some of its conviction, deflected by the shape and mass of the stone above it. Ezra spent the better part of that morning testing the theory the only way he knew how, walking the ridge with his hand out like a man reading a wall in the dark. The cold air, he came to understand, was not simply falling down the hillside in a straight line. It was following the shape of the rock, channeled by ledges and outcrops the same way water follows a ditch, and there was one long stretch of stone that appeared to be doing something the rest of the hillside was not. It was blocking the wind's path entirely and holding a measure of the previous day's sun long after the sun itself had gone. He did not have a name yet for what he was looking at. He only knew that the deer had found shelter there without a single tool, without a single log, using nothing but patience and the shape of the land itself. By the time Hannah called him down for breakfast, Ezra had already decided something Nathaniel would not have approved of, and something the rest of the valley would spend the following weeks calling a very expensive mistake. He was not going to move the cabin south. He was going to build against the stone. Word travels fast on a ridge road, faster than most men expect, and by the time Ezra had cleared the first section of ground against the stone outcrop, half the valley already knew what he intended to do. He was not building a house. Not yet. He was building a wall, 13 feet of it planned end to end, stacked directly against the same boulder face where the deer had bedded down. No roof over it, no floor beneath it, just stone against stone, rising slowly through the shortening days of late autumn while a house that did not yet exist waited somewhere behind the idea. The first wagon that stopped to look was driven by a grain merchant named Otis Fell, a man who had never met Ezra before that morning and felt no particular need to soften his opinion. He asked, plainly enough, whether Ezra had lost his money before or after deciding a wall was worth more than a roof. Ezra kept working. He had learned, in the 2 weeks since Nathaniel's visit, that explaining the reasoning before the wall existed only invited more doubt, not less. A stack of boulders with no house attached to it did not look like insulation. It looked like a man building a monument to something he could not quite name. By the second week, the joke had a name of its own. Folks in town had started calling it Holt's Folly, said with the particular fondness reserved for a story people expect to end badly. Even Nathaniel, riding past on his way to check fence lines, slowed his horse just long enough to shake his head without saying a word, which somehow stung more than anything Otis Fell had said aloud. Hannah did not understand the joke, and Ezra did not explain it to her. She understood only that her father spent his days moving stones too heavy for her to lift, and that some evenings he came back to the cabin with his hands scraped raw and his shoulders bent in a way that frightened her more than the cold ever had. "Is it going to work?" she asked him one night, not as a challenge, only as the plain question of a child who had already lost enough to be careful about hoping for things. Ezra did not have proof yet. He had a patch of bare ground where a deer had once bedded down, and a hand that had felt something on that stone he could not fully explain to a grown man, let alone a 6-year-old. But he told her the truth as best he understood it that evening, which was that the ground itself had already shown him an answer, and that his only job now was building something that could listen to it properly. She accepted that the way children sometimes accept the things adults cannot yet prove, and she went back to sleep beneath her mother's quilt, while her father returned to the wall before first light. 13 feet of stone, rising slowly against a hillside that the rest of the valley had already decided would defeat him. Building a wall of that size without a crew was slower work than Ezra had allowed himself to admit at the outset, and it demanded a kind of patience the flood and the fever had already taught him whether he wanted the lesson or not. He started with the largest stones he could move, setting them along the base in a line that followed the natural curve of the outcrop rather than fighting against it. His father had built fences that way decades earlier, choosing to work with the land's own contours instead of forcing a straight line where the ground refused to offer one. Ezra found himself relying on that same instinct now, though the scale of it left him exhausted by the middle of most afternoons. Each stone had to be tested before it was set. Some rocked slightly when he pressed against them, a small movement that told him the ground beneath had not been packed properly, and those he pulled back out and reset before moving forward. It was slow, deliberate work, closer to something a mason would recognize than anything Ezra had done before in his life, and more than once he found himself wishing for a second pair of hands he did not have. The middle section of the wall rose faster than the base had, mostly because the stones there were smaller and easier to lift, though Ezra was careful to keep the largest ones concentrated low and close to the outcrop itself. He had come to believe, without yet having the proper words for it, that the heaviest stone closest to the rock face would hold the most warmth from whatever daylight reached it, the way a kettle left near a fire stays warm longer than the air around it. By the middle of the third week, the wall stood roughly 9 feet along its longest completed stretch, and Ezra allowed himself, for the first time since the flood had taken his old farm, a small and cautious kind of pride. That pride lasted exactly as long as it took for a hard rain to move through the valley 2 nights later. He heard it before he saw it, a low, groaning shift in the dark that did not belong to wind or weather, he recognized. By the time he reached the wall with his lantern held high against the rain, a section near the northern end had begun to lean, the stones above shifting slightly against a base that had not been packed as firmly as the rest. It was not a collapse. Not yet. But it was close enough to one that Ezra stood in the rain for a long while, watching the lean by lantern light, understanding for the first time just how much damage one poorly set stone could do to weeks of careful work. By morning, the lean had settled into something worse. A crack had opened along the mortar line where 2 of the largest stones met, running nearly 2 feet up the wall before disappearing into a joint that Ezra had packed too quickly in his hurry to beat the coming rain. His first instinct was to patch it and keep building, the same instinct that had sent him packing clay into the cabin's log walls weeks earlier. He caught himself before he reached for the trowel. Patching had not solved the cabin's problem. It had only hidden it long enough for the wind to find a new way through, and he did not intend to build the same mistake into something 13 feet tall. Instead, he spent the better part of a full day doing something that felt, to anyone watching from the road, like standing still. He studied the crack. He traced where the water from the previous night's rain had pooled at the base of the wall, and where it had not. He noticed, for the first time, that the ground beneath the failed section sloped very slightly toward the wall rather than away from it, funneling rainwater directly against the base instead of letting it drain past. It was not the stone that had failed him. It was the ground beneath the stone, the same kind of quiet, unnoticed detail that had nearly cost his family a warm night back in the cabin. Otis Fell happened to pass on the road that same afternoon, and this time he did not ask about money. He asked, almost despite himself, what exactly Ezra had found staring at a crack in a wall for the better part of an hour. Water, Ezra told him. It wasn't the stone that gave way. It was where the water was allowed to go. Otis did not have a response to that, and he rode on without his usual joke, which Ezra noticed but did not remark upon. Over the following 3 days, Ezra dismantled the failed section stone by stone, numbering nothing, relying instead on the shape and weight of each rock, the way a man relies on a memory he trusts. He dug the base 4 inches deeper along that stretch and packed it with smaller broken stone before setting the larger boulders back in place, angling the ground beneath them so that water would now run away from the wall instead of pooling against it. The crack did not return. More importantly, Ezra had learned something the crack alone could never have taught him without the failure that came before it. The wall's strength depended as much on what happened beneath the ground as on what rose above it, and no amount of careful stacking would matter if the earth underneath was quietly working against him. By the start of the 4th week, the wall reached its full 13 feet along the section directly behind where the new structure would stand, and Ezra began raising the frame that would lean against it. He built it as a steep A-frame, rather than the 4 square walls he had used before, angling the roofline to shed snow rather than fight against its weight. The design borrowed something from barns he had seen built by Norwegian families 2 counties over, families who had faced winters harder than anything this valley usually offered and had learned, generations back, that a roof did not need to resist snow so much as it needed to give the snow somewhere to go. One side of the frame rose directly against the boulder wall, close enough that the stone itself became part of the structure, rather than simply standing near it. The other side sloped down toward open ground, low and steep, cutting the wind's approach to almost nothing. Hannah was the one who noticed it first, 3 evenings after the frame went up, and the first section of roof boards had been nailed into place. She had wandered to the back corner of the new structure while Ezra banked the evening fire, and she called out to him with the particular urgency children reserve for discoveries they cannot yet explain. "The wall's not cold," she said, her small hand still pressed flat against the stone. "It's not warm either, but it's not cold." Ezra crossed the room and put his own hand beside hers. She was right. In the plain and simple way children are often right about things adults have overcomplicated. The stone was not radiating heat the way a stove might, but it held something different from the night air pressing against the far side of the structure, something steady that neither of them had words for yet. What Hannah was touching, though Ezra would not fully explain it to her for another few days, was stored warmth. The wall had spent the daylight hours absorbing whatever sun reached that side of the hillside, and now, hours after the sun itself had gone, it was releasing that warmth back slowly into the small room they had built against it. It was not fire. It was patience, held inside 13 feet of stone, giving back a little of what it had taken in. For the first time since the flood had taken his old farm, Ezra allowed himself to believe the wall might do exactly what the deer tracks had first suggested to him, weeks earlier, on a frost-covered morning he had almost walked past without stopping. The first real snowfall came 10 days after Hannah pressed her hand against the stone, arriving not as the season's worst storm, but as a modest, early warning, the kind the valley usually saw at least once before the harder weather settled in for good. Ezra had finished sealing the roof boards only 4 days earlier, working later than he liked by lantern light to close the last gaps before the weather turned. The structure was not fully complete. The far wall, opposite the stone, still had gaps between the boards wide enough to let daylight through, patched only with canvas and a few loose bundles of dry grass he had meant to replace properly before winter arrived in earnest. Still, when the snow came, it came gently enough to offer something Ezra badly needed, a real test, on a scale small enough to survive a mistake. He and Hannah spent that first night inside the new structure rather than the old cabin, banking a modest fire in the small hearth he had built into the base of the stone wall itself, close enough that the fire's heat would feed directly into the boulders behind it, rather than simply warming the air and drifting away. By morning, the difference was plain enough that even Ezra cautious as he had become about trusting good news too quickly, allowed himself to note it. The side of the room nearest the stone wall stayed noticeably warmer through the night than the side facing open ground, and the water bucket near the hearth showed no skin of ice at all, unlike the frozen bucket that had greeted him in the old cabin weeks earlier. But the test also revealed exactly what Ezra had feared it might. Snow driven by a shifting wind overnight had found its way through the gaps in the canvas-covered wall, leaving a thin dusting across the floorboards nearest that side of the room by morning. The stone wall was doing precisely what he had hoped. The rest of the structure was not yet doing its part to hold that warmth inside. Nathaniel rode past 2 days later, drawn as much by curiosity as by his usual fence inspections, and found Ezra reinforcing the weak wall with a second layer of boards and a thicker packing of clay and dry grass between them. "Heard the walls holding?" Nathaniel said, in a tone that was not quite an apology, but came close enough to one that Ezra noticed. "Half of it is," Ezra answered honestly. "The other half still has some convincing to do." Nathaniel studied the reinforced wall for a long moment, then glanced toward the stone side of the structure, where a thin curl of smoke rose steady and unbothered from the chimney Ezra had built into the boulder face itself. He did not offer to help move Ezra south again. He simply nodded, the way a practical man nods when the arithmetic in front of him has started to shift, and rode on without another word. The storm that arrived 3 weeks later was not the kind anyone in the valley discussed lightly. Older residents compared it, in tone if not in exact detail, to a blizzard from years before that county records would later describe only briefly, the sort of storm remembered less by dates than by what it had cost each family who lived through it. It began on a Tuesday evening, with a stillness that Ezra had come to recognize as more troubling than wind itself. The kind of quiet that settled over the ridge just before the sky decided what it intended to do. By midnight, snow was falling sideways, driven by gusts strong enough to rattle the reinforced wall Ezra had finished only weeks earlier. He and Hannah stayed close to the hearth, built into the stone. The fire fed steadily but not recklessly, the way Ezra had learned to manage it after weeks of watching how the boulders behind it responded to heat. The stone was doing exactly what it had done during the smaller storm, holding warmth and releasing it slowly back into the room, even as the wind outside climbed toward something closer to a roar. Then, somewhere near 2 in the morning, the wind changed direction. It was a shift Ezra had not fully prepared for, coming not from the direction the outcrop had always deflected, but curling around from the north instead, finding the one seam in the reinforced wall that had not yet been tested by weather this severe. Hannah woke coughing, not from cold exactly, but from a thin, cutting draft that had found its way in low along the floorboards, carrying snow with it in a fine dusting that had not been there an hour before. Ezra faced a decision with no obvious right answer. Opening the wall to repack the seam properly would let in more cold and more wind while the storm was at its worst. Ignoring it risked the draft widening as the night wore on, and Hannah's cough was already worse than it had been minutes earlier. He chose a middle path, one he was not certain would hold. He packed the seam from the inside with the dry grass and canvas he had kept in reserve for exactly this possibility, working quickly by firelight while Hannah huddled wrapped in her mother's quilt, as close to the stone as he could safely place her. It was not a permanent fix. It was not meant to be. It was meant to hold until morning, and Ezra spent the remaining hours of that storm awake beside the fire, feeding it carefully, watching the packed seam for any sign it was failing, uncertain until the first gray light whether the structure he had built with his own hands would prove itself worthy of the risk he had taken on it. The storm broke sometime before dawn, the way storms in that valley often did, exhausting themselves against the mountains before the sun had fully risen to witness the damage left behind. Ezra stepped outside first, leaving Hannah asleep beside the stone, and found a hillside transformed by roughly 18 inches of new snow, deeper in the drifts where the wind had piled it against fences and outbuildings across the valley floor below. The reinforced wall had held. The packed seam, checked by lantern light through the worst hours of the night, had not widened further, though a thin line of frost along its edge showed exactly how close the wind had come to finding its way through completely. What Ezra had not expected was the sound of a wagon on the ridge road less than an hour after sunrise. It was Nathaniel, and he was not alone. Otis Fell rode beside him, along with 2 other families Ezra recognized only by sight, all of them picking their way carefully up a road still thick with drifted snow. Nathaniel's own barn roof, Ezra would learn within minutes, had partially collapsed under the weight of the storm, and 2 other families on the valley floor had lost stored firewood to a shed wall that had given way entirely, leaving cords of fuel exposed to snow that would take days to dry out again. "You still have a fire going up here," Nathaniel said, and it was not quite a question. Ezra nodded toward the chimney, where a thin curl of smoke still rose steady against the pale morning sky, the same modest signal that had marked the structure through every test since the first light snowfall weeks earlier. "Wall held the heat better than the wind could take it away," he said. "That's most of what it ever needed to do." Otis Fell said nothing about money this time. He looked instead at the length of stacked stone rising 13 feet along the hillside, 13 feet that 3 weeks earlier he had joked about as an expensive mistake, and he did not offer another joke to replace the one the storm had apparently taken from him. It was Nathaniel who finally asked the question the whole group had ridden up the hill to ask, though none of them had said it aloud until that moment. He asked whether Ezra would be willing to explain, plainly and without embellishment, exactly how a wall of stacked boulders and a steep-roofed frame had managed to outlast a storm that had cost 3 other families on that same ridge a portion of their winter supplies. Ezra looked back once at the smoke still rising from the chimney, steady against a hillside that had nearly broken him only weeks earlier, and he began, for the first time, to explain out loud what the deer tracks and the frost, and one cold morning with his daughter's hand pressed against warm stone had slowly taught him. By the following spring, 2 other families on that same ridge had begun building walls of their own against the rock faces scattered across their land, following a design that had started, as far as anyone in the valley could recall, with one widowed farmer and a 6-year-old girl who had noticed something in a stone that the grown men around her had walked past for years. Nathaniel Price rebuilt his collapsed barn roof with a steeper pitch that following summer, modeled loosely on the frame Ezra had raised against the boulder wall, and he never mentioned the advice he had once given about moving south to flatter ground. Otis Fell, for his part, stopped calling it Holt's Folly sometime before the first snow of the following winter, though nobody in the valley could say exactly when the name had quietly disappeared from conversation altogether. Ezra never claimed to have invented anything new. What can be said with reasonable confidence, based on the kind of construction that later spread through that stretch of the county, is that families in similar rocky terrain across parts of the northern frontier had built against stone in comparable ways for generations before him, using methods passed down through Scandinavian and German farming communities long familiar with turning difficult ground into shelter rather than fighting against it. Ezra had simply arrived at the same lesson alone, on a hillside nobody else wanted, guided by little more than a set of deer tracks and a willingness to trust what the land itself was trying to show him. Hannah grew up in that structure, and years later, family stories later claimed, she was the one who taught her own children to press their palms flat against a stone wall on a cold evening and wait, patiently, to feel the difference between air that had never held warmth and stone that had been quietly saving a little of it all day long. The wall itself still stands today, weathered but intact, no longer remarkable to anyone who passes it on the Ridge Road, which is perhaps the truest measure of how completely an idea once considered folly can become simply the way things are done. It had never been about the size of the stones, or the number of hours Ezra spent stacking them alone through a season no one expected him to survive. It had been about a father who refused to fight the hillside directly, and chose instead to listen to what 13 feet of patient, unremarkable rock had been trying to tell him all along. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.